Hi everyone, thanks for joining me again. I've got with me Danielle Vella, who is Director of the Reconciliation Programs for the Jesuit Refugee Service, which is an international humanitarian organisation that serves refugees in 50 countries worldwide. She's also a journalist and the JRS editor. She's a writer for the African Jesuits AIDS Network, Canadian Jesuits International. She's a reporter for Vatican Radio, contributor to the Tablet. I mean, I could probably list this off for her. Her credentials are so extensive, we could probably be here all day. But why is she with us today? She has been one of the finalists for our Witold Pilecki International Book Award in the category of the Special Prize for War Correspondents for her book, Dying to Live. Danielle, so much. Thank you for joining me today. I'm really, really excited to talk about this book.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Do you know what? Let's kick off with our first question, which I give to all of our speakers, and that's what's inspired you to write this book?
Right. Okay. So this is essentially a book, Dying to Live, stories of refugees on the road to freedom. So it's essentially a collection of stories of refugees. So of refugees from different countries around the world, seeking refuge in different parts of the world, who shared their stories with me. I have been working with this international humanitarian organization, the Jesuit Refugee Service, for more than 20 years. And since I come from a journalistic background, listening to refugees and sharing their stories has always been a really important part of my work. Why? I think the inspiration for me comes from two sources. One is my faith. So I believe in a God of social justice who wants to see on earth his kingdom where so-called the last come first. So people who are forced to become refugees really need this justice, to see this justice become a reality in their lives. Unfortunately, many times this is not the case. So it's a human rights issue too. So one of the things that I think, as I have seen in my years of working with this refugee organization, refugees often find themselves without voice to tell their story. And I see this as helping them to reclaim their voice. And I'm inspired, as I said, by my faith and a strong belief in social justice to do this.
So what is new in this book and what makes it so unique?
There are many books about refugees and their stories that want to tell refugee stories, and many very good in-depth articles in many newspapers and magazines as well. And this is the question which was asked by the publisher as well. And I think what this book has, which maybe is not found so much in other such publications, is that it has the stories of refugees from many different countries. So countries of origin. For example, I interviewed refugees from Eritrea, South Sudan, Iraq, Afghanistan, Morocco, to name a few, who are seeking refuge in different countries in the world. That's one thing. So it's not in one geographic place, but scattered. The other thing is that I interview refugees at different stages of their journey. So some of them are, for example, in a refugee camp in a remote place in a sub-Saharan African country, waiting for the chance to move on. Some are like really on the way. They've just come off one of those migrant boats and they're waiting to move to the next stage of their journey. And I also went to the US, for example, to visit some who actually reached the promised land, who reached their destination. And I do think that this is a unique selling point in the book. It spans the whole journey, if you want, from beginning to end of the refugee experience in different places.
Okay, so has working this book inspired a range of new topics that haven't been researched or written about before?
This would be difficult for me to say because I would have to do a whole lot of research myself to answer that question. But what I can say, so I thought about this, I have thought about this while writing the book. So I have been interviewing refugees now to get their stories, to share them with wider audiences for more than 20 years. And what struck me when I was doing the interviews for this book is that I came across reasons for flight which I hadn't been aware of before. And this amazed me. One of those very specific example is refugees who came. So I met them in Bahia, which is the Spanish enclave in Moroccan territory, where many refugees try to come, because if they manage to cross from Morocco into that enclave, they're on EU territory. So then they can apply for protection there. And over there, I met these young men who had come from the Western Sahara, which is a vast expanse of desert, where you have the states of Morocco, Mauritania, and Algeria bordering. And over there, it's a vast territory, very difficult to police, very difficult to control, where you have what we might call, loosely defined, these mafias, okay, who, of course, they run very lucrative businesses in trafficking, in smuggling of arms, of fuel, of migrants. The young men who I met who came from there had been kidnapped, sometimes as children, and forced to work in forced labor camps, really even branded like beasts of burden, forced to work before they could flee. And I think this is one area which really deserves more research and exploration. And I say it too, because after I interviewed these guys, I researched, to find more background. And it wasn't easy to find stories like this. And so much background about what's going on there. You'll find, yes, about the smuggling networks, the trafficking networks, but about this particular plight, this was something which really I would myself like to delve more into.
I find that really interesting because we don't realize this is happening, and this has been the same theme pretty much through all of my podcasts for this, that this is happening now. This is happening right now. It's not happening 50 years ago. It's not happening during the German invasions or occupations. This is happening in 2021, these sorts of incidents.
Yes, of course, they're happening now, and they're happening as a matter of course in many countries across the world. And that is why now we have more than 70 million people who are on the move, who have been forced to become refugees because these kind of things happen every day. 70 million is not a small number, So yes.
Well, it's really interesting because in your book, because like you said, you've interviewed refugees from literally around the world. And it's something that you come back to this idea is identity and what happens to their identity when they have to leave home. So for example, leaving home to being on the run, to seeking safety, to try finally being somewhere safe. Can you tell us a little bit about this identity that they have?
Yeah, so this is something which really hit home. As I said, I've been interviewing refugees for many years, and while every story, and I really want to emphasize this, every story is unique. There is no such thing, as the typical refugee story, as the typical profile even of a refugee youth, even if they come from the same country, because every story is unique. But there are then these threads that you can pick out, and one of these threads is really the loss of identity, that when you're forced to leave everything that is familiar to you and that you lose your very sense of who you are. And two things I would like to share, and they're not actually in the book, although I do, refugees in the book do share about this. But many years ago, I was in Sri Lanka, the time when there was still the civil war. And I met there this elderly Tamil man in the north. And he said to me, he was for many years a refugee in India, just next door, but enough to change his life completely. He told me, when I was in my village at home, I was a respected civil servant. I was a landowner. I was a member of the Citizens Committee, which would be the committee which looked out for people's rights in that location. Then I crossed the strait to India, and then I just became a refugee like everyone else. You lose everything. And when I give talks about the book, I also like to quote the words of Hannah Arendt, because she became a refugee, when she fled Nazi persecution and she went to the US. And I just want to share these words that she said because I find them so moving. We lost our home, which means the familiarity of daily life. We lost our occupation, which means the confidence that we are of some use in this world. We lost our language, which means the naturalness of reactions, the simplicity of gestures, the unfettered expression of feelings. Once we were somebodies about whom people cared. We were loved by friends. So this loss of identity is a really integral part of the refugee experience. And this is also why I am inspired to give refugees a platform to share their stories, because the way we say our story is so much about our identity. It's about how we see our reality and how we want others to understand it and how we want them to understand us. So in building a new life, I think this is really critically important to accompany refugees to recover that sense of identity, which has been really threatened by the refugee experience.
It's quite horrific thinking of this whole identity. I mean, I think that out of the whole book, there's a few things that struck me in your book. Obviously, the identity thing was the main thing, because you're losing everything within yourself. Could any one of us sitting here listening to this right now imagine losing everything? Your language. I mean, I couldn't imagine any of this, being completely stripped and having nothing and no one.
And and this is really something which you have to listen to the stories to really understand, and to listen to the individual stories to see how it hits home in a very individual way. And even for refugees who have made it, even those who have reached the US, which is really the promised land, for many of them, or a European country, now they're safe, they're comfortable. They start talking about home, many will start to cry. Because that's the place I used to go eat ice cream. That's where my parents are still there, and God knows when I'm going to be able to go back. That's where I had my first date. That's where so it's not just leaving with only the clothes you have on you. That's one part of the experience for many, but it's also leaving all those memories and everything behind to go to somewhere where you are. As my elderly friend in Sri Lanka had told me, you are a nobody.
There's another story, and I did bring this up at the beginning of our chat before we started, was the story about Hussein. I think it's about chapter 3, something along those lines. And he's a teacher. He's in Pakistan. He's teaching children that are Catholic and Muslim side by side. And then he gets threatened by the Taliban. And his story for me probably. Okay, there were some other amazing stories, but for some strange reason, his story struck a chord with me, of standing up for these innocent children. I think that probably would have been the reason why it struck that chord, was the children. But can you tell us a little bit more about Hussein and his story?
And so I'm happy you asked me about Hussein, because he's one of the stories that really struck me, because as a person, he really struck me. I cannot say in which country I met him, because he's still so afraid now of retribution that he didn't want me to say where he is. But he is really someone who lost everything because of what he believed in. And he's such a man of such dignity, such integrity. He couldn't speak English very well, and that made, in a way, his narrative even more powerful, because he was trying so hard to find the words he wanted to say. And he was in Pakistan. He started a private school, and it was a school that welcomed children who were Christian and Muslim both. And in many places in Pakistan itself, this would be absolutely fine, but unfortunately there was a Taliban commander who had a different point of view, and he would go and say, send the Christian children away. And Hussein was very clear in saying, no, why? Let the children come to school as well. What's wrong? Our own faith doesn't tell us that this is wrong. Why? Let them come and learn side by side. And, in his place, when he was telling the story, I would have been thinking, oh my God, I would have been afraid. He was not afraid. He had so much courage because of the simple conviction of his beliefs. And he paid for that, you know? And first they set fire to the desks in the school, and still he didn't give up. And then they came to his home where he was with his family. And they shot and they killed the dog. And when he's saying this, he says, yes, she was a nice dog. But they loved her. She was a German Shepherd. Then he got afraid and he left. They followed him. So he left to go to a different part of Pakistan. Pakistan is an enormous country. They found him. They shot at him. They killed his best friend. He was riding pillion. His friend was riding the motorbike. They shot and they killed his friend. So even living with that, Then he just fled. He left his family there because the road is so dangerous, the road to find a safe place, the journey, that he didn't want his family to risk that. He went ahead, he sold his wife's jewels, and he left. He finally reached Europe, a European country, after a very dangerous journey, managed to bring his family to join him after he got refugee status. But the very moving thing is that still he's like in Pakistan, he was a school owner. He had a house with an orchard. He had horses. He was rich. Now he's really struggling to make ends meet in a very entry-level job, So much so that his son, and this is sad, his son told him, why is it that when you come for me at school, all the other dads have cars and we don't have one? And he had tears in his eyes when he told me this. And he always tells his son, don't worry, God knows, God understands, it's going to be okay. And he really paid the price. Yes, he's safe, but he's still paying the price actually for the courage of his convictions. So I think that story encompasses a real lot of the issues that come out. We talk about people who are forced to flee for their lives.
So when these refugees end up fleeing, where do they go? Obviously we've got different countries have different areas of where they go to, but can you give us an overview of where some of these people, where they can go, where it is safe?
I think the most important thing to say is that contrary to popular belief, and also contrary to sometimes the rhetoric in the world's richer countries, the vast majority of refugees in the world, the vast majority end up in the poorer regions of the world because they end up in the countries directly neighboring those that they flee. So, for example, in Central Asia, in the Middle East, in Sub-Saharan Africa, so the countries hosting the largest populations of refugees in the world also have significant issues, usually of poverty themselves, of governance, and so on, without the structures to host such large numbers of refugees. Some cannot guarantee the basic health services and the basic education services and the employment for their own, let alone for massive refugee populations. And it's worth saying that many of them do their best, from government down to the locals, to offer a welcome. But then, especially when refugee situations are very prolonged, lasting years, which is a reality, of course, compassion fatigue also sets in, unfortunately. Given the reality in these poor places where the poorer places where refugees end up when they first leave, it's no surprise that many want to move on. They want to move on in their journey to try to find a better place where they can give themselves and, most importantly, their children a future and a hope. And that's where we see them trying then to reach European countries, to reach the US, Australia, if they're in that part of the world, and so on. And many of them will try to go to places where there are already people, networks whom they know, as of course we would all do. If you're leaving, as we said earlier, not knowing anybody, you go where you know a friendly face and when someone can help you get on your feet. Is that allowed in the current system of protection that we have? No, not so much at all. But that's another story.
people knew I was going to touch on the subject because it is quite important. I mean, how much does the media, I mean, bringing up the media is an interesting point in itself, but how much does the media actually distort these people's stories? Because, you know, you've got pages of this is happening and this is happening, and obviously every country experiences the crisis differently, or refugees differently. How, for you, in your opinion, does all of this kind of piece together?
I think, as you said, it differs from country to country, but I think it's quite safe to say that, yes, the media in general, at let's say some segments of the media, not all, and this reflects also trends in society, trends in government as well. So I would say more shifting towards the right wing, you know, those sections of the media. Yes, of course, they do distort refugee stories, and unfortunately, sometimes they find fertile ground for that. And I think it's even bigger than just saying, and I do want to emphasize as well that just as there is media that does distort, there is also media that tries to offer a fair and an accurate picture, and one that is more kind of thing to solicit a response that really respects the human rights of the refugees, a response based on compassion and social justice. But a significant amount of the media don't do that. They distort. Beyond the media, I think it's something bigger. I think it's the way we listen to refugee stories, the way how much we are ready. I think it's very much to do with stereotypes. And in all the years I have been interviewing refugees, whenever I offer them the chance to share their stories, most of them really jump at the chance. And there are many reasons for that, but one of them is this, that there are so many stereotypes about refugees, who they are, why they leave their country, why they are coming to our country, the risks they supposedly pose to life as we know it. And all these stereotypes, as stereotypes do, they neglect what is important to say. They say a lot which isn't true, and they get the thing completely wrong. So refugees, they welcome, as it were, the chance to set the record straight. No, this is my story. Let me tell you what my story is, not a stereotype, which is then used for political purposes, etc., etc. And this is another reason why I think storytelling is so important.
Danielle, thank you so much for joining me. That's an incredibly heartbreaking podcast that we've just recorded, talking about the refugees, and especially Hussein, because like I said, his story really touched me, and it's heartbreaking that he fought for his school, for his children, for people just to be together, if that makes sense, in a way, and to education. I'm going to stop ranting because otherwise we'll be here all day listening to me talk about Hussein and his story. But again, thank you so much and good luck.